Hi there and welcome to this introduction using the xamRadialGauge found in the NetAdvantage WPF Data Visualization Suite. So you can see that we have the gauge here within the window, and I'll show you how to set up all the different pieces of the gauge. So we have the needle, we have the labels, the tick mark groups, and all the pieces of the gauge. And you'll notice here also I'm interfacing with the value property of the gauge itself, so I can come through and say that I want it to be 15, or I can make it 80. And so just going over the basics of working with the gauge. Let's go down into Visual Studio and I'll show you how to get started. So to begin, we'll start with a very simple ViewModel class that we'll use for the view in order to bind up to the radial gauge. And so we'll just have the start value, the end value, and the actual value that we're displaying out to the user. And so these are just properties that are set to implement iNotifyPropertyChanged. You won't see this method implemented here within this class because I'm inheriting from the ViewModel base, and its job is just simply to implement iNotifyPropertyChange. So the ViewModel here is very, very basic. If we go up to the view, we'll bring in a couple different namespaces. We've got infragistics.controls.charts, and that gives us access to the radial gauge. And then also the ViewModel namespace itself, so the project name, views, and then the xamDigitalGauge. Within the window resources, I'm declaring an instance of the ViewModel, giving it a key of ViewModel, and then for the layout root, I'll set the data context equal to the ViewModel. And then I just have some basic layout here. I've got a grid where I'm putting the top row is the gauge and the bottom row is the text box. And so to really get started with the gauge, you obviously want to declare it, and we're just giving it a name of gauge. And then you need to define some scales. So here I have IG gauge, xamRadialGauge scales, and then below it I'm instantiating the radial gauge scale. So the end angle is 410 and the start angle is 130, and if you play with these, you can get a sense of what changing them will look like. So the end angle, when I switched it to 500, it took the end of the scale and brought it overlapping the 0. So you'll have to find what works appropriately for the gauge in the way it's laid out for you. We'll take this back to 410, and now we've got a nice open gap at the bottom between the two. So the end angle and the start angle are the ones that you'll manipulate in order to decide how it's angled within the gauge itself. The end value is coming from the ViewModel, so we're simply binding to the end value in the ViewModel, and the same is done with the start value. So then the composition of the gauge is made up from label groups, which obviously is the numbers, the tick mark groups, which is the little dots, and then the needles. And in this case we only have one needle on the gauge, but you could add in more if you'd like. So for the label groups, I'm simply opening up a single radial gauge label group, giving the font size of 12 and the foreground of black. And the extent here, what you're changing at this point is how close the text is from the middle of the gauge. So if we bring it at 0.65, if I were to bring it in to say 0.3, then it would be right in the middle. So if you're having a gauge that maybe had numbers on the inside and on the outside, you'd create a couple different label groups and change the extent for how it needs to show up within the gauge. So for this instance though, we'll just stick with 0.65. For the tick mark groups, you can see that we have two groups set up in here. We've got the light gray dots and the dark gray dots. So the first tick mark group, its end extent is 0.85, which is the same as what we have for the labels, and the interval of 10. And so going from our start value to our end value, at a value of every 10, we'll get a tick mark group. And then we have another tick mark group here doing the same thing at the interval of 10, and its initial position is 5, so we're moving it in a little bit more, and this has a little bit of a darker background. And so this gives us our two tick mark groups that show up within the grid, and we have the different colors so you can kind of differentiate between the large sections and the smaller sections of the tick mark groups. And then lastly we have the needles, and this is where we're pointing to the real value. So we've brought it in using IG gauge, radial gauge scale needles, instantiating a needle here, giving it a background of a darker gray. Start and end extent here defines where it will show up within the gauge. So if I change this say to 0.9, you can see how it splits it out there more. Make this 0.7. The start extent 0.5, and so even if you wanted to have partial needles, you could make that work as well. So that gives us a nice needle that rests in the middle of the dial and shows up far enough away from the values that you can still see what each one of the numbers are. And we're finally getting the value from the view model by binding to the value itself. And that gives us all the markup that's required in order to set up the gauge. The final thing of the sample is I simply put a stack panel on the page and just bound this text block to the same property in the view model and allowed the data binding mechanisms to update the gauge when I changed anything within the text box. So there you go. That's getting started with the xamRadialGauge.
Infragistics. On the web at infragistics.com.